The beeping was the only sound I remember. Not my son's voice, not my daughter-in-law's footsteps rushing through a door. Just the steady, indifferent rhythm of a machine that didn't know or care who I was, only that my heart was still beating. I had been standing in the cereal aisle at Kroger when it happened. One moment I was reaching for the oatmeal on the second shelf, the kind my late husband Gerald always said tasted like cardboard but ate every single morning for 31 years. And the next moment, the fluorescent lights above me seemed to tilt sideways. My hand caught the edge of the shelf. A box of granola fell. And then I was on the cold linoleum floor, and a teenage store employee was kneeling beside me saying something I couldn't quite hear. I was 67 years old. I had lived alone in Dayton, Ohio for 4 years since Gerald passed. I had raised one son, given him everything I had, worked double shifts at the school district for 22 years so he could go to Ohio State without debt. I had attended every one of his baseball games, driven him to practice in a car with no air conditioning in July, sat in the bleachers with a broken ankle because I refused to miss his senior championship. And I was lying on the floor of a grocery store, alone, while a boy who couldn't have been older than 19 held my hand and told me help was on the way. The ambulance came in 4 minutes. I know this because later, a paramedic named Dennis told me so, almost proudly, as if the 4 minutes were something he had personally achieved. I wasn't able to respond to him at the time. My left side had gone heavy in a way I had no language for. Not numb exactly, more like it had been replaced by something that weighed 3 times what it should. At the hospital, they used the word stroke. They used it carefully, the way people use words they've learned to deliver gently. Ischemic, they said. Caught early. Treatable. The doctor, a young woman with tired eyes and a kind voice, told me I was lucky that someone had found me quickly. Lucky. I lay in that hospital bed and thought about luck for a long time. My son's name is Derek. He is 41 years old. He lives 23 minutes from that Kroger. I know because I have driven the route many times, bringing casseroles he never asked for, and birthday cakes for my grandchildren that his wife always seemed faintly irritated to receive. Derek is an account manager at a logistics company. He coaches his son's soccer team on Saturday mornings. He is, by most visible measures, a good man. The hospital called him at 2:14 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because the nurse, a heavy-set woman named Carol, who reminded me of my own mother, told me she had tried. She said it with an apology already built into her voice, the way people speak when they're delivering news they wish they didn't have to. He didn't answer. They called again at 2:31, at 2:47, at 3:03. By the time I had been moved from the emergency bay to a room on the 4th floor, they had called my son's cell phone 9 times. They had called his wife's number, listed as secondary emergency contact, 6 times. They had left 3 voicemails. At 4:20, a text was sent to both numbers from the hospital's patient communication system. The text included my name, my room number, and the words, "Please contact us as soon as possible." I know all of this because Carol told me 2 days later when I was coherent enough to ask. She told me with the same careful voice, the same apology in her eyes. I appreciated her honesty. I could tell she was the kind of woman who believed people deserved the truth, even when it hurt. I spent the first night alone. A different nurse checked on me every few hours. The woman in the bed across from mine, separated by a thin curtain, coughed softly throughout the night and once called out a name I didn't recognize. The machines beeped. The hallway outside was never entirely quiet. I lay there in the dark and tried to remember if I had told Derek about the doctor's appointment I'd had 2 weeks before. the one where my blood pressure had been described as a concern. I didn't think I had. I hadn't wanted to worry him. I had spent so many years not wanting to worry him. By the second morning, the left side of my body was responding better. The doctor said the clot had been small relative to what it could have been. Physical therapy would be necessary. Speech was unaffected. I would need rest and monitoring. I would not be able to drive for at least several weeks. A social worker came to speak with me about discharge planning. She was young and thorough and asked about my home situation with a clipboard in her lap. I told her I lived alone. She wrote something down. She asked if there was family who could assist with my recovery. I said I had a son nearby. She smiled and wrote that down too. He arrived on the afternoon of the second day. I heard him before I saw him, his voice in the hallway asking someone where room 412 was. When he came through the door, he looked the way he always looks when something has disrupted his schedule. Not unkind exactly, but slightly compressed around the eyes, as if he were doing a calculation he hadn't planned for. He hugged me. He asked how I was feeling. He sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at his phone twice in the first 5 minutes. I told him I was going to be all right. He said that was good. He said he had been in back-to-back meetings. He said Kristen, his wife, sent her love, but she was dealing with something with the kids. He stayed for 45 minutes. Before he left, he said he would figure out the logistics of getting me home and that I shouldn't worry. I thanked him. I watched him walk out the door. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I am not a woman who cries easily. Never have been. Gerald used to say I was the most composed person he'd ever met, and he meant it as a compliment, and I took it as one. But lying in that bed after Derek left, I felt something I didn't have an immediate name for. It wasn't sadness, exactly. It was more like clarity. The kind that comes when you've been trying not to see something for a very long time, and suddenly the light shifts. I thought about the 9 unanswered calls. I thought about the 45-minute visit. I thought about the apology already built into Carol's voice. And I thought about my neighbor, Ruth. Ruth Gallagher had moved in next door 3 years ago, after her own divorce. She was 54, a retired librarian with a vegetable garden she tended with a devotion I found admirable, and a tabby cat named Senator who occasionally wandered into my yard and was always welcome. Ruth had brought me soup the week after Gerald's funeral without being asked and without making a fuss about it. She had driven me to a follow-up appointment the previous spring when my car was in the shop and refused to let me pay for gas. She did not know I was in the hospital. I had not thought to call her. In the emergency, I had only thought of Derek. I asked Carol if she could help me make a call. Ruth answered on the second ring. When I told her where I was and what had happened, she was silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "I'm coming." Not, "Oh my goodness," or "Let me check my schedule," or "Have you already called Derek?" Just 2 words, immediate and certain. She arrived that evening with a canvas tote bag containing a book she thought I might like, a container of homemade chicken soup, my brand of hand lotion, which I don't know how she knew, and Senator, whom she'd arranged to have her sister watch. She sat with me until visiting hours ended. She came back the next morning. On the morning of the 3rd day, Derek called. He said he had talked to Kristen, and they thought it made the most sense for me to go to a short-term rehab facility rather than come home right away because they weren't really set up for that kind of thing at their house. He said he had looked into a couple of places. He said he would handle everything. I told him I was going home. I told him Ruth had offered to stay with me for the first 2 weeks. I heard the relief in his voice before he covered it with protest. He said he wasn't sure that was the best plan. I said I was 67 years old and I appreciated his input. There was a pause. Then he said, "Okay, Mom, if that's what you want." It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. Ruth drove me home 4 days after I had fallen in the aisle at Kroger. She had already been to my house. I'd given her the spare key, and had filled my refrigerator with things I could eat easily, and put fresh sheets on the bed, and left a glass of water on the nightstand. She had also, I noticed, moved the throw rug in the hallway that Gerald and I had bought at a craft fair in 2009, because she had decided, without being asked, that it was a tripping hazard. I stood in my own kitchen and looked at the small adjustments she had made, and felt something loosen in my chest. She stayed in the guest room for 16 days. She drove me to physical therapy every Tuesday and Thursday. She made coffee every morning before I woke up and left it in the pot without making a production of it. We watched old movies in the evenings, and she pretended to like the ones I chose even when I could tell she didn't. Senator slept at the foot of the guest bed and occasionally at the foot of mine. Derek came to visit 8 days after I got home. He came on a Sunday afternoon, stayed for 2 hours, brought flowers from the grocery store. He was pleasant. He asked good questions about my recovery. He and Ruth were politely friendly with each other in the way of two people who have identified each other correctly and are being careful. Before he left, he mentioned that there was a conference in Chicago the following month, and he and Kristen were going to turn it into a small vacation. He said it in the way people mention things that are already decided, not things they are asking about. I said that sounded nice. He kissed my forehead and left. I watched his car pull out of the driveway and sat with what I felt for a while. I had spent 41 years being this man's mother. I had shaped my life around his needs and his comfort and his convenience, had folded myself into the margins of my own existence to make more room for him, had told myself it was love, and it was. It was love. But I had also told myself things were fine when they weren't, had chosen not to see what was there to be seen, had made excuses for small absences until the absences were no longer small. 9 unanswered calls. 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon. Flowers from a grocery store. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that too. Anger would have been simpler in some ways. What I felt was more like the quiet that comes at the end of a long conversation when you finally understand what was actually being said. I called my attorney the following week. Her name is Margaret Chen, and she has handled my affairs since Gerald's estate was settled. I told her I wanted to review my will. She didn't ask me why in a way that expected an answer, only said she had an opening on Thursday. I had written my will 8 years ago. At the time, I had left everything to Derek. The house, the savings, the small investment account Gerald and I had built carefully over 40 years. This had seemed correct at the time. It had seemed like what a mother does. I sat across from Margaret on a Thursday morning in October, and I told her what I wanted to change. She listened without expression, which is one of the things I like most about her. When I was finished, she said she could have the new documents ready by end of the following week. I told her that would be fine. I did not tell Derek. I want to be honest about this. I considered it. I am not a woman who makes decisions out of spite, and I examined my own motivations carefully, the way Gerald always encouraged me to do. He used to say that the difference between a decision and a reaction is about 30 minutes of quiet. I took more than 30 minutes. I took several weeks. I sat with it in the mornings over coffee, in the evenings when Senator came to visit, during the drives to physical therapy when the Ohio sky went gray and low the way it does in November. What I kept coming back to was not the 9 unanswered calls, not the 45-minute visit, not the rehab facility suggestion, or the Chicago vacation, or the grocery store flowers. What I kept coming back to was a simpler question. If I had died on that linoleum floor in Kroger, what would Derek have lost? He would have lost a mother who arranged her life to make his easier. He would have lost someone who came to soccer games and kept her concerns to herself and never asked for much. He would have inherited a house and a savings account and an investment portfolio that represented 40 years of careful, modest living. And what had he given in return? Not love. I do not doubt he loves me in the way he is capable of loving, which is real but bounded and primarily theoretical. What had he given in presence, in the small, ordinary currency of showing up? I knew the answer. I had known it for longer than I wanted to admit. Ruth was asleep in the guest room the night I made my final decision. Senator was on the couch beside me. I had the will on my lap, a draft Margaret had sent for my review, and I read through it slowly in the lamplight. I made 3 changes from what I'd originally proposed. I added a 4th. Then I called Margaret in the morning and told her I was ready. The holidays came. Derek and Kristen hosted Thanksgiving. They invited me with genuine warmth. I don't want to tell this story in a way that makes my son into a villain, because he isn't one. He is a man who learned from watching me that love is something you can take for granted because it will always be there. That is my failure as much as his. We had a pleasant dinner. His children, my grandchildren, 8 and 11, were loud and sweet and interested in me in the uncomplicated way children are when adults haven't yet taught them to be otherwise. Kristen made a beautiful pie. I drove myself home. My driving restriction had been lifted in November. In January, I did something I had been thinking about since the days in the hospital. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center 3 blocks from my house. I had always wanted to paint. Gerald had given me a set of brushes for Christmas in 2018, and they were still in the closet in their original packaging. I took them out and brought them to my first class. I was not good. This didn't trouble me. Ruth came to the second class. She had no prior interest in painting either, which made her the ideal companion for learning it. We sat at adjacent tables and made imprecise flowers and laughed quietly at our own results. And the teacher, a patient man named Vincent, said we were both improving more than we knew. I turned 68 in February. Ruth brought a cake. My grandchildren sent drawings in the mail. Their mother had apparently organized this, which I noted without comment. Derek called in the morning and again in the evening, both calls warm and of reasonable length. I was happy. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters. I was genuinely happy. Not despite everything that had happened, but in some way because of it, because I had finally stopped arranging myself around an absence and started building something in the space that remained. In March, Derek called on a Tuesday evening. He sounded the way he sounds when something has unsettled him, the compression around the voice that I had learned to recognize over 4 decades. He said he had been talking to his cousin, Gerald's nephew, a well-meaning man who knows more than he should about other people's business. And the cousin had mentioned something about the will. Derek said he didn't want to make a big deal of it. He said he was sure there was a logical explanation. He said he just thought we should talk. I told him I'd be happy to talk. I invited him to come on Sunday. He came without Kristen, which told me he understood this was a serious conversation. He sat at my kitchen table where he had eaten cereal before school for 18 years, and he asked me, carefully, whether I had changed my will. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment, then he asked why. I didn't answer right away. I poured us both coffee, and I sat down across from him, and I looked at my son, this man I had made and raised and loved through everything. This man who had not answered 9 calls while I lay alone in a hospital. and I told him the truth. I didn't say it unkindly. I did not list grievances or catalog failures. I told him what I had realized lying in that hospital bed, that I had spent so long making things easy for him, that I had made it possible for him to never learn what I actually needed. That the will wasn't punishment, that it was honesty, that it was me, finally, telling the truth about what had actually happened between us in the quiet accumulations of years. He was quiet for a long time. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the window. He looked at his hands. Then he said, quietly, "I didn't know you needed me there." I looked at him. I said, "Derek?" They called 9 times. He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. We talked for 2 hours. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had, and it was hard, and I am glad we had it. He cried, which I had not expected. I did not. Some things don't change. He asked if there was any chance I would reconsider. I told him the will was not something I intended to change back. I told him what I had changed it to: the house and a portion of the savings to a trust that would benefit his children, my grandchildren, directly on their 25th birthdays. A portion to Ruth, because she had earned it in ways that have nothing to do with blood. A portion to the library system where Ruth used to work, because Gerald had loved libraries and I had never done anything about that while he was alive, and it felt like time. A small remainder to Derek, because he is my son, and I do not subtract love from money, but I also do not confuse the two any longer. He left that Sunday without resolving anything, because there was nothing to resolve. The decisions were made. The documents were signed. All that was left was the ongoing work of figuring out what we were to each other, now that I had stopped pretending we were something we hadn't been. Ruth was at her sister's that weekend. When she came back Monday evening, she found me in the kitchen making dinner. A real dinner, not something from a can, pasta with vegetables and the good olive oil. And she came in and put her bag down and said, "How did it go?" I told her. She sat down at the table and listened to all of it. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you okay?" I thought about it genuinely, the way she deserved. "Yes," I said. "I think I actually am." Senator wandered in from the other room and jumped onto Ruth's lap with the entitlement specific to cats who believe all spaces are equally theirs. Ruth scratched behind his ears. I stirred the pasta. Outside, it was March in Ohio, which means it was gray and cold and held no particular promises. But the kitchen was warm. The olive oil smelled good. My left side moved the way it was supposed to, mostly with only the faintest reminder some mornings that it had once gone heavy on a grocery store floor. I had fallen in the cereal aisle. No one who was supposed to come had come. And somehow, in the long, strange year that followed, I had ended up with a life that was more honestly mine than anything I had lived in the previous decade. I had a neighbor who was a better friend than most people get in a lifetime. I had grandchildren who sent crayon drawings through the mail. I had a watercolor class on Thursday evenings where I was still not very good and didn't mind at all. I had a son I was learning to see clearly, which is harder than loving someone and easier than pretending. I had kept the house. I had kept the savings. I had made my choices with open eyes and a quiet mind. And I had stopped waiting for someone to show up who was never going to arrive. That, I had finally learned, is not giving up. That is simply knowing the difference between what you hoped for and what is actually true. And choosing, at 68, on a cold, gray Ohio morning, to build your life around what is true. It is the most difficult thing I have ever done. It is also, by a considerable distance, the most freeing.